Adrian walked through the long, wide hallway of the music building, keeping his head down. He was used to moving this way, like a ghost drifting through a room full of living people. The building was old and smelled of floor wax and old paper, a smell Adrian actually liked. It was the smell of hard work and history. But today, that smell mixed with something else, the sharp, sweet scent of expensive perfume and fresh coffee. Around him, the hallway was loud and full of life. Students were everywhere. They wore long wool coats that looked brand new, scarves made of soft silk, and leather boots that clicked loudly on the stone floor. They carried instrument cases that gleamed in the light coming through the tall windows. They laughed and talked about their classes, about the difficult pieces they were learning, and about the famous teachers who had praised them that morning. They moved with a special kind of confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you belong. Adrian pulled his own coat tighter around himself. It was a thick coat, made of rough wool that scratched his neck, and it was a dark, muddy green color. It wasn't ugly, but it was very old. There were small holes near the cuffs where the fabric had worn away, and the elbows were thin and shiny from years of being leaned on tables. His pants were gray and faded, a little too short, showing his socks that didn't quite match. On his feet, he wore sneakers that were clean but had white tape on the sides to cover the tears in the canvas. He tried to stay close to the wall, hoping the shadows would hide him. He didn't want to bump into anyone. He knew what happened when he got too close. The stream of students would part around him like water flowing around a rock in a stream. They didn't do it to be mean, exactly. They did it because he wasn't really there to them. In their world, he was part of the background, like a radiator or a fire extinguisher. He clutched the strap of his bag. It was a simple canvas bag, the kind you get cheap at a grocery store. Inside, it held everything he owned, his lunch, which was just an apple and a piece of bread wrapped in a napkin, and his stack of sheet music. The music was old, too. The pages were yellow and brittle, held together by tape and careful hands. To Adrian, those papers were worth more than gold. "Excuse me," a voice said sharply. Adrian flinched and stopped moving. He stepped to the side quickly, pressing his back against the cold wall. A girl walked past him, carrying a cello case almost as big as she was. She didn't look at him. She was looking at her phone, talking to a friend next to her. She hadn't even really seen Adrian. She had just sensed something in her way and expected it to move. Adrian watched her go. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a mix of sadness and something else, determination. He looked at his hands. They were rough, red from the cold outside, and the fingernails were cut short. Most people looked at those hands and saw a worker. They saw someone who carries boxes, scrubs floors, and fixes broken things. They didn't see a musician. He wasn't a student at the conservatory. He couldn't be. To get in, you needed money for lessons, money for tuition, and the right clothes to wear to the audition. Adrian had none of those things. He had grown up in a small apartment on the other side of the city, where the trains rattled the windows all night and music was something you heard on the radio, not something you learned in a grand hall. But Adrian had a secret. He had a gift that he couldn't explain. He had found it when he was very young. He had been walking past a shop that sold old electronics and he had heard a piano. He didn't know what it was, but the sound stopped him in his tracks. It felt like the music was pulling at his insides, like a hook in his heart. He had stood there for an hour, just listening, until the shop owner chased him away. Since that day, he knew he had to play. He taught himself. It wasn't easy. He couldn't afford a real piano, so he drew a keyboard on a piece of cardboard. He practiced on that cardboard every night for hours, pressing his fingers down on the paper, hearing the notes in his head. He learned to read music from library books he borrowed, using a flashlight under his blankets so he wouldn't wake his family. He memorized the sounds, the rhythm, and the feeling of the keys. Eventually, he found a way to be near the real thing. He had taken a job cleaning the music building. It didn't pay much, but it gave him access. For 3 years, he had mopped these floors, dusted these statues, and emptied these trash cans. The other staff members were kind enough, but they didn't understand why he worked so slowly sometimes. They didn't know that he was stopping to listen. He walked past the practice rooms now. The doors were open, and he could hear the music spilling out. In one room, a violinist was playing a fast, difficult song. The notes were sharp and fast, like rain on a tin roof. In another, someone was playing the trumpet, loud and bright. Adrian paused for a second by a doorway where a girl was playing the piano. She was good. Her fingers moved fast, and she hit all the right notes. But as Adrian listened, he felt something was missing. It was perfect, yes. It was clean and precise. But it sounded like a machine. It didn't have any sadness in it, or any joy. It was just sound. He knew he shouldn't judge. He knew she was talented and he was just the cleaner. But he couldn't help it. He felt that music was supposed to tell a story. It was supposed to make you feel something deep in your stomach, like a punch or a hug. When he played on his cardboard keyboard, he played with everything he had. He played his hunger, his tiredness, and his dreams. He played the sound of the train tracks and the sound of the wind in the alleyways. Hey! Watch where you're going. Adrian was pulled out of his daydream. He had drifted into the center of the hall without realizing it. A tall boy with a shiny saxophone case almost bumped into him. The boy glared at him, looking annoyed. He adjusted his expensive coat and gave Adrian a look that said, "You don't belong here." "Sorry," Adrian whispered. He lowered his eyes quickly. "Cleaners," he heard the boy mutter to his friend as they walked away. "They're always underfoot. You think they'd learn to stay in the corners until we're gone?" The friend laughed. It was a polite, empty laugh. Adrian kept walking. His face felt hot, even though the hallway was cool. He wanted to shout back. He wanted to tell them that he knew music better than they did. He wanted to tell them that he could hear the mistakes they made, the tiny pauses where their heart wasn't in it. But he didn't say a word. He just tightened his grip on his canvas bag and kept walking. He turned a corner and left the main hallway. The crowd of students thinned out here. The floor changed from shiny stone to dull linoleum. The lights were dimmer, buzzing with a faint humming sound. This was the basement level. This was where the storage rooms were, where the old instruments went to die, and where the janitors kept their supplies. This was Adrian's real world. He walked past rows of metal shelves filled with cleaning supplies. The smell of bleach and lemon cleaner was strong here. It wasn't a bad smell, really. It meant safety. It meant he had a job. He pushed his cart into a small room at the end of the hall. This was the break room, but it was empty right now. He sat down on a plastic chair. He let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding all day. He reached into his bag and pulled out the apple. It was bruised on one side, but it looked good to him. He took a small bite, the juice sweet and sharp in his mouth. Across from him, leaning against the wall, covered in a thick layer of gray dust, was an old upright piano. It was a sad thing to look at. The wood was scratched, and one of the legs was cracked. The ivory keys were yellow and some of them were chipped. It hadn't been tuned in years. The students upstairs wouldn't even touch it. They said it hurt their fingers and ruined their technique. They demanded the best, the newest, the most expensive instruments. But to Adrian, it was beautiful. It was a beast waiting to wake up. He finished his apple and threw the core into the trash can. He wiped his hands on his pants. He looked at the door to make sure no one was coming. Then, he stood up and walked over to the piano. He gently lifted the heavy lid that covered the keys. A small cloud of dust puffed up. Adrian sat down on the bench. It was hard and uncomfortable. He put his rough, red fingers on the yellow keys. He didn't press down yet. He just let them rest there. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the smell of bleach and the basement faded away. He couldn't hear the students upstairs anymore, he couldn't hear the traffic outside. He could only hear the music in his head, waiting to come out. This was who he really was. Not the boy in the green coat. Not the cleaner. He was a musician. And tonight, when everyone else went home, the old piano in the basement would sing. The days that followed were quiet for Adrian, but inside his chest, there was a storm building. The date for the grand showcase was getting closer. It was all anyone in the building could talk about. It was the biggest night of the year for the conservatory. The main concert hall would be filled with important people, rich donors, famous music critics, and talent scouts from all over the world. For the students, this was the night everything could change. If you played well, you could get a record deal or a scholarship. You could become a star. Adrian saw the posters everywhere. They were printed on shiny, thick paper and hung in gold frames on the walls. The names of the performers were listed in elegant black script. These were the top students, the ones who wore tailored suits and silk dresses. These were the ones who practiced in the glass-walled rooms on the upper floors, where the sunlight poured in and the acoustics were perfect. Adrian had never played on a stage like that. He had never played a piano that was perfectly tuned. He only knew the old, dusty upright in the basement and his imaginary keyboard at home. But he knew he was good. In fact, he knew deep down that he was better than good. The music he heard in his head was complicated and beautiful, full of colors and emotions that he couldn't explain with words. He spent every night in the basement, teaching himself pieces that were supposed to be too hard for anyone without a teacher. He was currently working on a piece by Liszt. It was a piece that required your hands to move fast, very fast, jumping all over the keyboard. It was supposed to be impossible for a self-taught pianist. But Adrian didn't care about impossible. He played until his fingers felt like they were on fire. He played until his wrists ached and his eyes burned from fatigue. He would close his eyes and see the notes dancing in the dark, and his fingers would find their way to the right places. He wanted to play. He needed to play. He felt like the music was a message he had to deliver, a story he had to tell. If he could just get on that stage, just for 5 minutes, he knew he could show them. He could show them that music isn't about the clothes you wear or the money your parents have. It's about what you have inside you. Finally, the urge became too strong to ignore. He decided he had to try. He had to sign up. He waited until the hallway was relatively empty. It was a Tuesday morning, and most students were in class or practicing. He took a deep breath, smoothed down the front of his rough green coat, and walked toward the administration office. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he thought people might hear it. He felt sweaty and nervous. The administration office was at the front of the building, far away from the basement. It had thick carpets and soft lighting. There were fresh flowers on the reception desk. The air smelled of expensive furniture polish and flowers. It felt like a different world. Behind the long mahogany desk sat the receptionist. She was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. Her hair was perfect, not a strand out of place. Her makeup was precise, and she wore a headset that matched her outfit. She was typing rapidly on a computer keyboard, her long nails clicking loudly. Adrian walked up to the desk. He felt very small. He stood there for a moment, clutching his canvas bag with both hands, waiting for her to look up. She kept typing. He cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me," he said. His voice sounded croaky and weak, like he hadn't used it in days. The woman didn't stop typing. She didn't even turn her head. She just let out a small, annoyed sigh. "I'm busy," she said sharply. "If this is about a lost key, go to the security desk." "No, it's not about a key," Adrian said, trying to make his voice stronger. "It's about the showcase. I want to sign up." The typing stopped instantly. The woman froze for a second, then slowly turned her head to look at him. She took in his messy hair, his old coat, and his worn-out sneakers. Her eyes narrowed. She looked at him like he was a bug that had crawled in from the street. "The showcase?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You mean the student recital?" "Yes," Adrian said. He swallowed hard. "I want to perform. I have a piece ready. It's the Listetude." She let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, it was a mean sound, like a bark. "List, do you have any idea who is playing in this show? Do you know how many years these students have been training? This is a professional event, not a talent show for the cleaning staff." "I can play it," Adrian insisted. He felt his face getting hot with shame, but he stood his ground. "If you would just let me audition for the maestro, or listen for a minute." "Listen," she interrupted him, turning her body fully toward him now. She looked angry. "I don't have time for games. People like you don't just walk in off the street and perform at the conservatory. You need to be enrolled. You need to pay fees. You need to wear the right clothes." She looked him up and down again, her lip curling in disgust. "And frankly, you don't look the part. We have a reputation to uphold. Imagine if someone like you walked out on stage in that rag. It would be a joke. It would disrespect the art." Her words hit him like physical blows. A joke. Disrespect. He felt his chest tighten, making it hard to breathe. He wanted to tell her that his coat was warm, and that his hands were clean. He wanted to tell her that the music didn't care about coats. "But the rules," he stammered. "The flyer said it was an open competition for talent." "For students," she snapped. "Not for janitors. Now, please leave. I have real work to do." She turned back to her computer and started typing again, dismissing him completely. Adrian stood there for a moment, stunned. He looked around the fancy office. He saw the gold-framed certificates on the walls. He saw the students walking past the glass door in the hallway, laughing and carrying their instruments. None of them knew he was there. None of them cared. To them, he was invisible. And to the woman behind the desk, he was worse than invisible. He was a problem. He turned around and walked out of the office. He didn't slam the heavy oak door, even though he wanted to. He closed it gently, because that was who he was. He walked back down the long hallway, but it felt different now. Before, he had felt like a ghost, unseen and sad. Now, he felt angry. He watched the students passing him, chattering about their dresses and their booties. They took it all for granted. They had the opportunities, the teachers, and the expensive instruments, and they probably didn't even realize how lucky they were. He passed a group of 3 boys standing near the water fountain. They were holding their violin cases. Adrian tried to walk past them quietly, but he wasn't fast enough. "Hey, look," one of them whispered, loud enough for Adrian to hear. "It's the basement guy. I think he tried to sign up for the show," another boy said, laughing. "My friend at the front desk told me." "Can you imagine the piano man in the janitor's uniform?" They laughed. It was a cruel sound, sharp and mocking. "He probably just wants to sweep the stage," the third boy joked. Adrian kept walking. He didn't look at them. He didn't speed up. He just kept his head down and kept walking, one step after another. But inside, he felt a hard, cold lump forming in his stomach. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was the feeling of a door being slammed in his face. He reached the stairs that led down to the basement. The air grew cooler as he descended. The noise of the students faded away, replaced by the hum of the lights and the smell of dust. It was quiet down here. It was safe. He went to the storage room and sat on his plastic chair. He looked at the old, dusty piano sitting in the corner. It looked sad, just like him. It was neglected and ignored by the people upstairs. "They think we're nothing," he whispered to the piano. "They think we're just trash." He reached out and touched the chipped keys. "But they're wrong," he said, his voice getting stronger. "They don't hear you. They don't hear us." He opened the fall board. He put his hands on the keys. He didn't care if the piano was out of tune. He didn't care if he was tired. He started to play. He played the Liszt piece, the one the woman said he couldn't play. The notes exploded out of the old instrument. They were raw and rough, but they were powerful. He played with a savage intensity, pouring all his anger and humiliation into the music. He played faster and louder than he ever had before. The bass notes rattled the floor. The high notes sang like a scream. He played until he was sweating and out of breath. He played until the hard lump in his stomach dissolved into the sound. For those few minutes, sitting on a plastic chair in a dusty basement, Adrian wasn't a janitor. He wasn't a poor kid in a green coat. He was a master. And the piano was his voice, singing the truth that the world refused to hear. The night of the showcase was finally here, and the entire building felt like it was holding its breath. The atmosphere in the concert hall was electric, a mix of excitement and high-stakes nerves. The stage was set up with bright, blinding lights and rows of empty chairs that would soon be filled with the city's most important people. Outside, expensive cars were pulling up to the curb, dropping off men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. Adrian, however, was far away from the glamour. He was in the basement, pushing his heavy cleaning cart toward the service elevator. He had a job to do, just like any other night. He was supposed to polish the brass railings in the lobby and make sure the glass doors of the entrance were spotless before the guests arrived. He was supposed to be invisible, a silent worker who made things nice for other people to enjoy. He was wearing his usual work clothes, his sturdy green coat, his loose gray trousers, and his taped-up sneakers. He looked out of place amongst the velvet curtains and the gold trimmings, but he was used to that. He kept his head down and worked efficiently. He sprayed the brass handles with cleaning fluid and rubbed them until they shone like mirrors. He swept the marble floors until they gleamed. As the hour of the performance grew closer, the building transformed. The noise level dropped, replaced by a hushed, reverent silence. The audience began to take their seats. The low murmur of polite conversation filled the air. From his hiding spot near the back pillars, Adrian watched them. They looked like a different species, so elegant and assured. They held their programs in manicured hands and talked about music theory and composers as if they were old friends. Adrian finished his assigned tasks in the lobby. He should have gone back to the basement then. He should have clocked out and gone home to his small, drafty apartment. But he couldn't make himself move. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He looked down the long, dark aisle that led to the stage. The stage lights were up, casting a glow on the massive black concert grand piano sitting center stage. That piano! It was the finest instrument in the entire building. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, worth more money than Adrian would earn in 10 lifetimes. He had never been allowed to touch it, of course. He wasn't even allowed to walk on the red carpet that covered the stage floor. He could only look at it from a distance, admiring its sleek, curved shape like a person admiring a star from the bottom of a well. He saw the ushers closing the large entrance doors. The concert was about to begin. The lights in the hall dimmed, creating a twilight atmosphere. The chatter stopped instantly. The conductor walked out onto the stage to applause, and the first performer, a violinist, began to play. Adrian stayed in the shadows at the very back of the hall. He listened. The violinist was incredible. The sound was pure and clear, soaring up to the high ceiling. But Adrian's eyes kept drifting to the piano sitting silently in the background, waiting for its turn. It looked so lonely there, so perfect. He wondered what it would feel like to sit at that bench, to feel those ivory keys under his fingers. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a physical longing. He had tried to do the right thing. He had tried to follow the rules and sign up the proper way, and they had rejected him. He had tried to tell them that he had something to give, but they had only seen his clothes. Now, he was just a cleaner, listening from the dark corners while someone else played. The program continued. A cellist played. A flutist played. They were all students Adrian had seen in the hallways, the ones who ignored him. They played well, but there was something missing for him. It was all very safe, very correct. They played the notes exactly as they were written on the page, but there was no danger in it, no raw life. Then, during the intermission, the lights came up partially. The audience stood up to stretch and talk. Adrian knew this was his chance. While everyone was busy in the lobby getting refreshments, the stage area would be empty. The security guards were usually outside dealing with the crowd. His heart began to race. It was a terrible idea. If he got caught, he would lose his job immediately. He would be embarrassed, humiliated, and banned from the building forever. But the music inside him was screaming so loud he could barely think. It felt like now or never. It felt like this was his only chance to speak, even if no one was there to hear. He moved silently, keeping to the edges of the wall. He slipped past the main group of people who were chatting near the doors. He moved like smoke, drifting down the side aisle. He reached the steps that led up to the stage. There was a small velvet rope blocking the way, with a sign that said authorized personnel only. Adrian stepped over it. The moment his foot touched the red carpet of the stage, the air felt different. It was lighter up here. The heat from the stage lights washed over his face. He walked toward the piano. It loomed larger and larger as he got closer, a black, gleaming beast. It was terrifying and beautiful. He reached out a hand. He didn't touch the keys yet, he just rested his fingers on the smooth, cold black wood of the body. It felt solid and real. He walked around to the bench. It was upholstered in black leather, padded and comfortable. He sat down. He felt very small on the vast stage. In front of him, thousands of empty seats stared back at him like dark eyes. But he didn't feel afraid of the seats. He felt afraid of the instrument. This was the kind of piano that could tell if you were lying. It demanded total honesty. Adrian took a deep breath. He pulled his sleeves up, revealing his rough wrists. He flexed his fingers. He didn't have any sheet music with him. He didn't need it. The notes were burned into his mind. He lifted his hands and hovered them over the keys. He closed his eyes. He blocked out the lights, the dust, the smell of the old hall, and the fear of getting caught. He thought about the cardboard keyboard he had practiced on as a child. He thought about the cold nights and the hunger. He thought about the woman at the desk who told him he was a joke. He let his hands drop. The first chord crashed through the silence of the hall. It was loud and deep, resonating through the floorboards and into the solace of his shoes. The sound was massive, filling the entire space instantly. It was so much louder than the old piano in the basement. It was like the difference between a candle and the sun. Adrian didn't stop. He couldn't have stopped if he wanted to. His fingers moved across the keys, finding the notes of the list etude he had been practicing in his head for months. On the old upright, the song had sounded rough and angry. On this instrument, it sounded like a thunderstorm. He played with a passion that was frightening. He wasn't just pressing keys, he was attacking them, caressing them, pleading with them. The music poured out of him, a torrent of sound that was fast and complicated. His left hand jumped across the lower registers, creating a rumbling rhythm, while his right hand flew up and down the high keys like a bird. He forgot where he was. He forgot he was Adrian the cleaner. He was just a vessel for the sound. He was telling the story of his life in those notes, the sadness of being ignored, the anger of being rejected, and the fire that refused to go out. He played the difficult sections, the ones that were supposed to be impossible. His fingers blurred. He made mistakes, tiny slips of the finger, but he didn't care. He played through them with such force that the mistakes didn't matter. The emotion was perfect. The acoustics of the hall caught the music and threw it back at him. He was surrounded by his own sound, immersed in a world where nothing existed but melody and rhythm. It was the most alive he had ever felt. It was worth the risk. It was worth losing his job. Just for this one moment, he was whole. He was so lost in the music that he didn't hear the side door open. He didn't hear the footsteps that echoed sharply from the back of the hall. He didn't see the figure standing at the end of the center aisle, watching him with a look of total shock. He only knew the music. And the music was taking him home. Adrian was lost in a world of sound, but suddenly, the world intruded. The heavy thud of a door closing somewhere in the darkness echoed through the vast hall, snapping him back to reality. His fingers jerked, hitting a jarring, discordant note that ruined the flow of the melody. The music stopped instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. Adrian's heart, which had been soaring with the rhythm, plummeted into his stomach. He froze, his hands still hovering over the keys, afraid to move. He listened intently to the darkness. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the center aisle. Panic, cold and sharp, washed over him. He knew that rhythm. It was the walk of authority, of someone who owned the space. It wasn't a security guard, it was someone important. Adrian scrambled to his feet, the bench scraping loudly against the stage floor. He grabbed his cleaning rag from where he had dropped it and instinctively tried to hide it behind his back. He looked toward the aisle, blinking in the glare of the work lights. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was an older man, tall and imposing, wearing a tuxedo that looked like it cost more than Adrian's apartment building. It was Maestro Vance. Adrian knew him immediately. Everyone in the music world knew Vance. He was a legend, a pianist who had traveled the world, known for being a genius who suffered no fools and had no patience for mediocrity. Adrian felt his knees go weak. He was caught. He wasn't just a trespasser, he was a nobody who had dared to touch a masterpiece. He prepared himself to be yelled at, to be grabbed by the arm, or even arrested. He started to back away, toward the side curtain, ready to run. I'm sorry, Adrian stammered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely get the words out. I was just cleaning. I didn't mean. I'm leaving. I'm sorry. He turned to flee, but the maestro's voice stopped him. Stop. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't angry. It was quiet, but it carried a strange weight that froze Adrian in his tracks. Don't move, Vance said. Stay exactly where you are. Adrian stood trembling, his back to the piano. He watched the maestro walk down the aisle. Vance didn't walk quickly. He moved slowly, almost as if he were drunk or in a trance. He kept his eyes fixed on Adrian, or perhaps on the piano behind him. He reached the edge of the stage and stopped. How long have you been playing? Vance asked. His voice was gruff, like gravel, but it lacked the cruel edge Adrian had heard in the secretary's tone. I don't play, Adrian lied, his face burning with shame. I hit the keys a little. I'm sorry, sir. I know I'm not supposed to be up here. Bull, Vance said sharply. He climbed the stairs onto the stage, his movements surprisingly agile for his age. He walked right up to Adrian. Up close, the maestro looked older, his face lined with deep wrinkles, but his eyes were piercingly bright. I have been in this hall for 40 years. I have heard thousands of students play on that instrument. I have heard professionals who charge a fortune for a ticket. None of them play with that kind of hunger. Vance walked past Adrian and touched the top of the piano, almost reverently. I was in the hallway. I heard you from the lobby. The list. The on sospiro. But you weren't playing it the way it's written. You were playing it like you were fighting a war. Adrian didn't know what to say. He lowered his eyes and looked at his scuffed sneakers. I just like the music, he whispered. You don't just like music and play like that, Vance said. He turned to face Adrian. Who is your teacher? Which professor are you studying with? Is it Mr. Holloway? He's the only one strict enough to produce that kind of discipline. I don't have a teacher, Adrian said softly. Vance frowned. You're not a student here. No, sir. Then how did you get in here? I work here, Adrian admitted, finally looking up. He gestured vaguely to his clothes, the green coat, the frayed trousers. I'm the janitor. I clean the floors. Vance stared at him. For a long time, he didn't speak. He looked at Adrian's rough hands, the redness on his knuckles, the worn fabric of his coat. It was as if he were seeing a ghost. The maestro looked at the piano, then back at the boy. "You?" Vance asked, pointing a finger at him. "You are the cleaner?" "Yes, sir." "The woman at the front desk?" Vance muttered, more to himself than to Adrian. "She told me a young man tried to sign up for the showcase, looking like a beggar. She told me it was a prank." "It wasn't a prank," Adrian said, a spark of defiance flashing through his fear. "I asked to play. She told me to leave. She said I would disrespect the art." Vance let out a short, harsh laugh. He shook his head in disbelief. "Disrespect the art? That woman wouldn't know art if it bit her on the nose." He took a step closer to Adrian. His expression softened, the hard lines around his mouth relaxing. "I have sat on adjudication panels for 20 years, Vance said quietly. "I listen to boys with perfect posture and million-dollar trust funds play technically perfect music. And I fall asleep. I get bored. It is all the same. It is safe. It is polite." He reached out and, to Adrian's shock, gently grasped Adrian's shoulder. The maestro's hand was warm and heavy. "But you," Vance said, his eyes searching Adrian's face. "You play like your life depends on it. You play like you have something to say. That is rare. That is the one thing you cannot teach in a classroom. You can't buy that. You either have it, or you don't. And you, my boy, have it in abundance." Adrian felt tears stinging the corners of his eyes. He blinked them away rapidly. "I just wanted to be heard," he whispered. "Just once." "You have been heard," Vance said firmly. He squeezed Adrian's shoulder and then let go. He turned back to look at the empty hall, the thousands of seats waiting for the audience to return from intermission. "They will be coming back soon," Vance said. "The second half is about to begin. I am supposed to be the keynote speaker. I am supposed to give a boring speech about the future of classical music and introduce the next performer." Vance turned back to Adrian with a mischievous glint in his eye. "But I think I have seen the future of classical music already. And he is standing in front of me in a green coat." Adrian's eyes went wide. "Sir. Go get your music," Vance commanded. "Is it in your bag?" "Yes, but I don't have formal clothes. I can't go out there like this." Vance looked him up and down again. "Do you think the piano cares about your coat? Do you think the music cares? Did Beethoven wear a tuxedo when he wrote his symphonies? No. He was a mess. He was filthy half the time. It didn't matter." "I can't," Adrian said, stepping back. "They will laugh. They will throw me out." "They won't laugh," Vance said, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "Not if I am standing next to you. Not if I tell them to listen. But you have to be brave. You have to go out there and show them who you are. All of you. Not the person you think they want to see. The real you." Vance held out his hand. It wasn't a handshake, it was an offer. Adrian looked at the hand. He looked at the maestro, a man he had idolized from afar for years. He thought about the basement, the cold, the years of being invisible. He thought about the shame he had felt in the office. This was the moment. The door was open, but he had to walk through it himself. His hands were shaking, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out the stack of yellowed, crumpled sheet music. "I'm ready," Adrian said, though his voice was barely a whisper. "No," Vance said, smiling slightly. "Don't be ready. Be hungry. Now, come with me. We have work to do." The lights in the concert hall were bright, much brighter than Adrian had expected from the stage. They felt like a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders. He stood near the piano, clutching his stack of yellowed sheet music. His hands were sweating, and he was terrified that the papers would slip out of his grip and fall to the floor. The hall was completely packed. Every single seat was filled. The audience was a sea of expensive fabrics and glowing jewelry. In the front row, the critics sat with their notepads ready, their pens hovering. They looked bored, impatient, waiting for the next student to play something predictable so they could check their watches. Standing in the wings, just off to the side of the stage, was Maestro Vance. He had told Adrian to wait while he went out to make an announcement. Adrian's heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his throat. He looked down at himself. He felt painfully exposed. He was wearing the same green coat he had worn to scrub floors. His gray trousers were faded, and his sneakers were taped up. He felt like a fake, like someone who had sneaked into a wedding and was about to be dragged out by the police. "Welcome back," Maestro Vance's voice boomed through the speakers. It was deep and commanding, silencing the few murmurs in the crowd. "We have a wonderful program for you tonight. But before we continue, I have decided to make a change to the schedule." A ripple of confusion went through the audience. People whispered to each other. Changes in the program were rare and usually frowned upon. "Music," Vance continued, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, "is not a contest about who has the most expensive instrument or who wears the finest tuxedo. Music is about truth. It is about the human soul. And sometimes, the truth comes from a place we do not expect to find it." Vance turned and gestured toward the side of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a young man I have just had the pleasure of meeting. He will perform the Liszt Etude. Please welcome Adrian." Adrian took a shaky breath. This was it. He forced his legs to move. He walked out onto the stage. As soon as he stepped into the light, a collective gasp went through the hall. It wasn't a gasp of delight, it was a gasp of shock and surprise. Hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto him. They saw the frayed cuffs of his coat. They saw the dirt under his fingernails. They saw the tape on his shoes. From the front row, the receptionist from the office stood up. Her face was pale, and her mouth was open in horror. She looked from Adrian to the maestro, shaking her head in disbelief. She looked angry that her domain had been invaded. The whispers started immediately. They weren't quiet. "Is this a joke? Who is that? He looks like a homeless person. Is this some kind of stunt? Security. Someone get security." The noise grew. It was a wave of judgment, crashing over Adrian. He felt his face burning hot. He felt small and dirty. He wanted to turn around and run back to the safety of the basement. He wanted to hide. Who was he kidding? He didn't belong here. They were right. He was just the cleaner. He walked over to the piano bench. The laughter was getting louder now. A few people were actually pointing. It was humiliating. It was the worst moment of his life. Adrian sat down on the bench. He didn't look at the audience. He couldn't. If he looked at their mocking faces, he would fall apart. He looked only at the keys. They were white and black, steady and unmoving. They didn't care about his coat. They didn't care about the money. They were just waiting for a voice. He placed his sheet music on the rack, but he didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He knew every note by heart. He closed his eyes for a second. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dusty air of the hall. He remembered the maestro's words. Be hungry. Adrian lifted his hands. The first chord crashed down like a thunderclap. It was so sudden and so loud that the whispers in the hall died instantly. It was like a slap in the face. The sound of the grand piano was massive, filling every corner of the room. It demanded attention. And then, Adrian began to play. The music started fast, furious, cascading waves of sound. His fingers moved across the keys with a speed that was almost frightening. It wasn't just fast, it was controlled chaos. It was the sound of a storm breaking loose. The audience was stunned. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound in the vast hall was the music pouring out of the instrument. Adrian forgot where he was. He forgot the fear. He let the anger he felt at the receptionist, at the students who had mocked him, and at the years of being invisible flow into his fingers. He played the piece with a raw, aggressive power that the students, with all their polite training, could never achieve. He played the sections that were supposed to be gentle, but he played them with a deep, aching sadness. It was the sound of loneliness. It was the sound of sitting in a cold room with only a cardboard keyboard for company. The melody floated over the audience, haunting and beautiful. People in the front row stopped looking at his clothes. They stopped looking at the maestro. They just closed their eyes and listened. The music swelled. It rose to a high, screaming peak, then dropped down to a whisper, soft as a breath. Adrian's body swayed with the rhythm. He was sweating now, his hair falling over his eyes. He was fighting the piano, wrestling a giant, and winning. He played the final, difficult passage. His left hand was jumping across the low notes while his right hand played a melody that seemed to go on forever. It was technically perfect, but it was more than that. It was alive. It felt like the piano was weeping and rejoicing at the same time. With a final, decisive strike of the keys, the music ended. The last note hung in the air, vibrating, echoing against the walls, before fading into complete silence. Adrian pulled his hands away from the keys. He sat there, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his nose. He sat still for a moment, staring at the piano. He was terrified to look up. He didn't know what he would see. Would they still be laughing? Would they be booing? Slowly, he turned his head. The audience was still silent. But it wasn't a hostile silence. It was a sacred silence. You could feel it in the room. It was the kind of silence that happens when something truly miraculous has just occurred. Then, in the back row, a man stood up. It was an older gentleman in a simple suit. He didn't clap. He just bowed his head toward Adrian in a gesture of deep respect. Then, Maestro Vance began to clap. He stood near the piano, clapping slowly and loudly. Clap. 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 Suddenly, the spell broke. A woman in the third row stood up and began to applaud. Then the man next to her. Then the entire front row, including the critics, stood up. The receptionist didn't stand, but she sat frozen, her face pale, realizing her mistake. The applause didn't just grow, it exploded. It was a deafening roar, a tidal wave of sound that washed over the stage. People were shouting bravo. And encore. They were clapping their hands raw. They weren't clapping because they were told to. They were clapping because they had been moved. They had witnessed a genius rising from the floor to touch the sky. Adrian stood up. He looked out at the sea of people. They weren't looking at his clothes anymore. They weren't seeing a poor janitor. They were seeing him. they were seeing the artist. He saw tears in the eyes of the people in the front row. He saw smiles of pure joy. He bowed. It wasn't a fancy bow. It was clumsy and deep, coming from the heart. He looked over at the maestro. Vance was smiling broadly, nodding his head. He walked over to Adrian and put an arm around his shoulder, ignoring the sweat on the boy's shirt. Together, they faced the audience. The applause got even louder. For the first time in his life, Adrian didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like he had to hide in the shadows. He stood in the brightest light he had ever known, wearing his old green coat and his taped-up shoes, and he knew he belonged. The music had set him free.